Kia ora everyone and welcome back to the IEMAX channel. Ahmed Mohi here. In my last video I talked about how to use the Azure Network Security Group to provide protection to your virtual machines and subnets on Microsoft Azure. Now if you're looking for more advanced feature, Microsoft has got another virtual firewall called the Azure Firewall that will provide you with those advanced features. So in this video I'll talk about what is the Azure Firewall and how to create one. So let's dive in. To start, let's first talk about Microsoft Azure Firewall. So Microsoft Azure Firewall is a cloud-based virtual firewall that you could use to protect your virtual machines and subnets on Microsoft Azure. You could use it to filter traffic between your virtual networks on Microsoft Azure and to and from the internet, and also traffic from your virtual networks to your on-premises network. Unlike the Network Security Gateway, Microsoft Azure Firewall is a fully fledged firewall. So it contains advanced security features like netting and intelligent traffic filtering, and it also gives you the classic 5 tuples of source and destination IP address, source and destination port, and protocol. In here, we are using the Azure Firewall to perform a netting where you assign a private IP address to your virtual machine, and then you want to access the machine from the internet, and for that you need a public IP address. So instead of exposing your virtual machine to the internet, you put it behind a firewall. You assign the firewall the public IP address, and when you remote to the machine from your external computer, you would use the public IP address of the firewall. The firewall would then translate this public IP address to the private IP address of the virtual machine. This way, you would connect to your virtual machine in a secure fashion, and you could apply all the security policies and traffic monitoring for any traffic that is distant to your virtual machine. In here, we've got the classic case of trying to reach a destination on the internet. In this case, we are trying to reach the Google public DNS, the 48 and 8844, and the source IP would be the server subnets, and the destination IP would be the Google public DNS, and the traffic that we want to pass in this case will be the DNS traffic, which is a UDP type of traffic using port 53, sorry. And finally, one of the features of the Azure Firewall is that you could use it to, in a similar fashion with the classic way where you have a source and destination, but the destination in this time is a URL, or what is called a fully qualified domain name, or FQDN. So instead of saying I want to allow traffic to 8888, or you put a specific IP address, you just say I want to allow traffic towards Microsoft.com or Google.com. In our scenario today, we'll create a virtual network with two subnets inside. One subnet for the Azure Firewall, and then the other for a virtual machine. We'll assign the virtual machine a private IP address, and then we'll assign the Azure Firewall a public IP address. And then we'll use the Azure Firewall to create netting or translation from the public IP address to the private IP address. And then we will create a policy to allow RTP traffic incoming towards the virtual machine. And then we'll create another policy to allow HTTP and HTTPS traffic toward the internet, outgoing from the virtual machine toward the internet. To start, from the Azure portal, in the Azure portal search, type in virtual network. Click on the virtual network in the search results, and click on the plus create to create a new virtual network. This will take us to the new, to the create a virtual network blade. We'll give it a subscription, and then we will assign it a resource group. We'll give it a name, and then we'll decide on the location where we host it. And then we'll assign IP addresses to it. So we will use the range of 10.1.0.0/16. We will create two subnets. We'll create the first subnet for the Azure Firewall subnet. Then click add, and then add another subnet. We'll call it server subnet. This is where we are going to host our virtual machine. And then again, click add. And then everything else stays the same. We'll review the machine, the virtual network, and then we will create it. And now that our virtual network is ready, we'll create the virtual machine. So from the home, go to the Azure portal search, and then type in virtual machines. Select create new virtual machine, and then assign it a resource group. Give the virtual machine a name. Decide where we are going to host it. In here, for the public inbound port, we'll use none, so we're not going to allow RDP in by default. Select the confirm for the license, and then next for the disks, and then networking. We will choose the IMAX VNet, and then assign it to the server subnet. For the public IP address, we are going to choose none this time, because we will assign the machine a private IP address. And we will use the firewall to translate our public to private IP address, so that we will provide more layer of security for our virtual machines. For our network security group today, we'll choose none, as we are not going to use the NSG to filter traffic. Instead, we'll use the Azure Firewall. Our machine now has passed the validation and is ready to be created, so let's create it. While our machine is being created, we'll go ahead and create the Azure Firewall. So from the home of the Azure portal, in the Azure portal search, type in firewall, and then pick firewall from the search results. Click on create new to direct us to the create new firewall blade. And again, pick your subscription and your resource group. Give the firewall a name. And then decide where do you want to host it. Leave the firewall tier to standard. And for our example today, we'll use the firewall with the classic rules. And for the virtual network, we'll pick existing one. For the public IP address, we will create a new one. And we'll leave everything else the same. So let's review and create. Our firewall is now ready to be created, so let's create it. As you can see, our Azure Firewall is ready now. So what we've done so far is that we created a virtual network with two subnets inside. We created an Azure Firewall in a virtual machine. What we need to do now is to tell the virtual machine to use the Azure Firewall for any outbound traffic. For that, we'll create a default route. From the Azure portal, in the Azure portal search, type in route table. So the way to create a default route is to actually create a routing table and then create a default route inside of it. And after that, assign that routing table to a subnet. The subnet will start to use this specific routing table for any traffic outbound. So to create a new routing table, click on the plus create. Assign the routing table to a resource group, and then give it a name. Click on review and create, and then create. Our routing table is now ready, so let's click on go to resource. And inside the routing table, click on the subnets, and we want to associate it with the server subnet, where we host our virtual machine. So click on the plus associate, and then pick the virtual network, and then the subnet. Click on OK. We have now associated the routing table with the server subnet. So let's add a route here. Click on the routes, and then click on the plus add route. Give the route a name. Put the address prefix or the route that you want to add, which in our case is the default route. which is the all 0/0. And to pick the Azure Firewall, we need to choose Virtual Appliance. In here, it's asking us about the next hop address or the IP address of our firewall. To find out the private IP address of our firewall, let's go back to Home. And from the Azure portal, let's type in Firewalls. Select Firewalls, and then select our firewall. And in here, this is the firewall private IP address that we want to put as a next hop. So let's copy that, put back here, and paste it, and hit OK. So what we've done now is that we created a routing table. We associated the routing table with our subnet so that the virtual machine would use it, and then we put the Azure Firewall as our next hop. Next, we want to allow our machine to reach Microsoft.com. So on the Azure Firewall, we'll create what is called an application rule to allow our machine to reach Microsoft.com. So let's do that. Let's go back to Home. From the Azure portal, and the Azure portal search, let's go to Firewalls. And then let's pick our firewall. And under the settings, we've got rules. In here, we've got three types of rules. We've got the NAT rules, network rule, and the application rule. So the first rule we are looking to implement now is the application rule. To add another application rule, click on the plus add application rule. Give your application rule collection a name. And then give it a priority. And then under the rules, under the target FQDN, we'll create a rule that will allow us to reach the Microsoft.com. So we'll call it Microsoft.com. And then the source IP will leave it to an IP address. And for what IP address that we will use in this case, it will be the server subnet. And then what is the protocols that we want to use? In our case, it's HTTP and HTTPS. And then finally, the URL. So now our rule is ready to be created. So let's click on Add. Next, we want to allow our machine to use DNS to resolve the URL of Microsoft.com to an IP address. So for that, we'll create a network rule, a classic network rule, to allow our machine to reach the DNS. So to add a new network rule, click on the plus network rule collection, and then also give it a name. And then let's give it a priority. And then under the rules, on the IP address, we'll create our rule. So we'll give it a name. And for DNS, we're going to use UDP. And for the source type, we'll leave it to IP address. And for the IP address of the source for the DNS, we'll use our server subnet. Destination IP, we'll leave it to an IP address. And then we'll put the IP address that we want to allow our machine to reach. And finally, what is the port that we want to use? In this case, it's 53 for DNS. And now our rule is ready, so we'll edit. Next, we want to create a network address translation. So our machine is using a private IP address, and we've got the firewall assigned the public IP address. So when we use the remote desktop, we'll use the public IP address of the firewall. The firewall will translate this IP address to the private IP address of the machine. So to do that, let's add a new routing rule here. So to do that, click on the Add NAT rule. We'll give it a name. And then for our NATing rule, we'll give it a name. And for the protocol that we want to allow here, it's a remote desktop protocol. remote desktop protocol is a TCP protocol, so we'll choose TCP. And for the source type, we'll choose IP address. This is the IP address of our machine that we'll use to that we'll use to RDP to our virtual machine on Azure. So for the source, we'll just leave it to any source. And for that, we'll use a star to signify any source. And for the destination address, we'll put the public IP address of the firewall. And then for the destination port, it's the RDP port, which is 3389. For the translated IP address, this is the private IP address of our virtual machine, which in our case, it's the 10.1.2.4. And again, for the translated port, it's the same port of RDP. So let's add that. So what we've done now is that on the Azure Firewall, we created 3 rules. One to allow the machine to reach the Microsoft.com. One to allow the machine to use the DNS. And then finally, a NAT rule to translate the public IP address of the firewall to the private IP address of the virtual machine. So we will be able to remote desktop to the machine. The final step here is that we need to tell the machine to use the Google DNS IP address for the DNS, because this is the only IP address we've allowed the machine to communicate over DNS. To do so, from the Azure portal, go to virtual machines. Let's go to our virtual machine. And then under the networking, we see here the network interface card. We click on the interface card. And from there, under the setting, we click on the DNS server, and then we choose custom. And in here, we put the IP addresses of our DNS. Our final test is now to remote desktop to the machine. So for that, we'll remote desktop to the public IP address of the firewall. And after that, we'll see if we are able to open up Microsoft.com URL, and if we are able to open up other URLs. So let's see that. So let's go to the firewalls to find out what's the IP address of the public IP address of the firewall. So from the firewall page, let's click on the public IP configuration. So this is our public IP address of the firewall. So we'll remote desktop to this IP, and let's see where we go. So we were able to remote desktop to the virtual machine, which is a good sign, which means that our RDP rule is working, or NATing is working. So the final test is that we need to open up Microsoft.com URL. So let's open up Microsoft.com. As you can see here, we are able to open up the Microsoft page, although it does sound strange because some of the content on this page has links outside of the Microsoft.com, so those will not work. So for example, if we open up the Google.com, it will also not work because it's being blocked. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below. And as always, stay strong, kia kaha. See ya.